Very good.
Amazing.
Yes, we're live.
We're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Great to be here. Great to see you again, Jennifer. Noemie.
Yeah, great to see you. See you both.
So we'll wait a couple minutes to have everybody joining the table, and then we'll kickstart this session. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Right. So I think we're going to kickstart this session. We have a lot on the table. So welcome, everybody. I'm Noemie Billion, Head of Business Development for North America at Greenly, and I'm thrilled to host today's discussion on one of the most timely and strategic shifts facing mission-driven companies, turning climate compliance into real business values. So just to set the scene, and before introducing our brilliant leaders here, over the past 12 months, we've seen climate regulations go from voluntary to mandatory fast. California's SB 253 and 261, the rise of IFRS S2, and the mainstreaming of frameworks like TCFD are creating a new playing field. And B Corps, we'll see, also news on this end. They're uniquely positioned to lead because of their DNA that's already blending purpose and transparency. So today we'll explore how all these compliance and frameworks are evolving and how to comply, how to build trust, resilience, and make them an advantage. So joining us today, Jennifer Harity, ESG and Sustainability Director at Sensiba, who's working with companies to embed ESG into governance and decision-making. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Noemie.
And Alexis Normand, CEO and co-founder of Greenly, who's building the tools companies need to transform carbon reporting into strategic insights. So let's kick off this session. So at the agenda today, quick introduction, we'll be decoding the Californian regulation and more broadly international frameworks covering TCFD and B Corps. And then how the new B Corp standard is a response to a compliance-driven era, and see how this can build value too. And then we'll cover how to go from compliance to real strategy. So as I was mentioning, we are in an accelerating landscape with climate regulations that are reshaping corporate disclosure. And the question is no longer if companies must act, but how well they're prepared. And so we'll see that it's not small feats, and there's still a lot to do on this end. So let's kick to the first topic. Here we can see on this slide that really it's still really underestimated, and climate change is no longer a distant environmental issue, and we create some emergency here to start this conversation. So first question I have for both of you. We're really seeing those new climate regulation. Why is that happening now? Maybe Jennifer, Alexis, you can shed light on this. What does this matter at this moment?
Absolutely. I think, we're seeing this stuff come up now because folks are seeing an increase in climate events and the planet getting warmer and more fires, more hurricanes, more floods. And we want to make sure that businesses are being held accountable, that they should be reporting. And California came out with 2 laws to help that, because this data not only informs and helps companies reduce their carbon emissions and footprint, but really helps, which I've got a case study later I'll share, really helps bolster the bottom line, and even in some cases get some great top line growth too, just from having the data from doing the measurement required for these 2 laws. 253 is the basically the climate emissions reporting law, so reporting scopes 1, 2, and 3. The reason why it matters right now to be really talking about this is going to start next year with scopes 1 and 2. So anyone who has a business in California or does business in California, which is kind of everybody, that is
Next year,
$1 billion.
2026 is reporting,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So anyone $1 billion or more in revenue, and that is total revenue for the organization, not just revenue in California, but total revenue for the organization, will need to report. And so in 2026, that's scopes 1 and 2. So that means you kind of need to know what you're measuring, how to measure it, where you're storing the data right now, because you should be measuring right now. So getting on this and getting ahead of it before you have to start playing catch up would be advisable. And then in 2027, they're adding in scope 3. So they're giving folks an extra year because, as we all know, scope 3 is kind of the kitchen sink of all the data. There's 15 different categories. So to really give us a little extra time to prepare and to do some kind of materiality assessments on what is material to organizations. Did you want to add something to that, Alexis?
Yeah, so I think, why companies need to do it. Of course, if they're if they're eligible to the regulation, it's kind of a no-brainer. But I think, why are those regulations happening now? In a sense, it's kind of easy for policymakers to push them when so many companies are already doing it. I think there's a tipping point. So before any of these standards came into force, they were already adopted on a voluntary basis. And I think if we could talk about the doom and gloom and all the problems associated to climate change, I think that's very obvious. But in a sense, it's also a medium-term threat for a lot of organizations. But what we've seen is a lot of organizations have seen a short-term win when they start disclosing their emissions. So a lot of them haven't really waited for these especially if you're doing $1 billion of revenue. Usually you haven't really waited for SP 253 or in the EU CSRD to get started. You've already done something. And why is that? Because at this scale, you have a significant amount of your business, which is selling to very large organizations who have adopted this already. And so one way, where does the business pressure come from? You have these leading organizations. So obviously, California has a lot of them, the big tech players, the Apples, the Salesforce, these kind of guys. They have been pressuring their supply chain to disclose their emissions because they have themselves set targets, Microsoft, Walmart, a lot of these guys. And of course, any big European company has been doing it already. So if you have like your 10 or even your 3 biggest customers who are those large enterprise, it's usually part of your RFP process. And so you've been doing it, all right? So another way to look at the whole topic is, well, maybe I've got 15% or 50% of my business which is at risk if I'm not disclosing my emissions. So what that has led to is that a lot of these businesses are already doing it. So now these regulations can say, well, you've got maybe 30% of companies above $1 billion of turnover already doing it. So what's really the pain in making it compulsory for everybody, because you've got all these people who've already seen the value. And then you start to reduce the threshold after a while, which is what we've seen in the EU, where it's not $1 billion of turnover, it's 150 million. So basically, or 250, sorry. So it's a quarter of that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
there's a point I do want to make is that in America, it's, a lot of public companies have been doing this, but a lot of privately held companies have not, even at the $1 billion and above mark. So a lot of public companies have been leading the way here in America, but the privately held have not been doing this work. And I think what was going to catch a lot of folks off guard is the small to medium-sized businesses that are within the supply chain of the companies that are mandatorily having to report now, that haven't been reporting up until this point, or even measuring up until this point. because they're in the supply chain, when those companies start to do the scope 3, we're going to get a trickle down effect. And small to medium-sized companies are already starting to get questions about their data, and to be able to stay competitive and to participate and to continue to have those larger clients to sell into. Think of the mom and pop manufacturer, food manufacturer that sells into Target or Safeway, grocery stores. Those very much are going to get caught off guard if they have not done this work.
And it was interesting to have both of your point of view on this question. Would you say this is a policy response to risks that we've been seeing before, or it's very a structural shift in how we value companies? Like, are we entering a climate accountability economy where doing this, even for the companies that are not doing 1 billion in revenue in California, is there a shift towards more giving more value to this type of climate resilience?
I can maybe say a word on this. I mean, initially, before California stepped in, there was a plan to have the SEC in the US ask any listed company to disclose their emissions. So apparently, events have decided otherwise. But why would the SEC consider that this is, their responsibility? It's because you can look at climate risk as, okay, maybe it's a business problem with my customers if, I can't work with Apple anymore because I'm not disclosing my emissions to them. But let's say you're a food company, a dairy company, okay? You're buying milk, and you have these suppliers, but now they have a physical risk of additional drought or additional natural disaster. And we've seen this happening now, not like in 10 years, where suddenly your supply chain, and that's particularly true in certain agricultural supply chains, well, droughts lead to lower yields for, you cows eating less grass and producing less milk. And suddenly it's a lot more expensive for you to buy your raw material. So what that means is if you're a Procter and Gamble or some other food company, right? Well, you face higher costs. So it's actually relevant to your shareholders to size the business risk, in technical terms, the materiality, of your exposure to climate risk. And what SP 253, or rather TCFD, requires companies to do is to assess the financial impact of their of climate change, which is really, if I'm a shareholder, how likely am I to lose money because this company has not anticipated something that it could mitigate against. And so that's another business reason. And sometimes markets are blind to, the midterm. So you need the legislator to step in to provide the transparency that markets will not produce themselves. So I think that's the thinking. That was the thinking for the SEC. It's apparently, I would say, postponed, but it is the thinking of the EU regulators. It is the thinking of a lot of stock exchanges in the world which already ask for this data. It is the thinking behind a lot of requirements from private equity, from major asset managers, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you have a 401k in the United States, basically, a lot of your retirement is tied to the returns of the companies that you've invested in. And if they are blind to something that could massively affect their value, well, it's a problem, not just for billionaires, but for your retirement.
Yeah. Yes, in the US, we are not going to see anything at the federal level for this for probably the next 4 years. It's pretty safe to say.
But whoever's managing your 401k, they will look at it because
obviously, yes. The work is going to be done.
Duty to their shareholders.
Yeah, the work is going to be done at the state level. And that's where we're seeing like these California laws, the 253 and 261, really come into play. Other states that are quickly following behind with stuff on their books to vote on already is Oregon and Washington, Illinois, New York, Colorado. So this work is really going to be done at the state level. And, to your point, I talked a little bit about 253, but 261 is reporting your climate related financial implications, right? So, a lot of companies are going through, like the companies up in the northern parts of California where all the wildfires are, they suddenly can't get business insurance or insurance for their properties because the insurers have pulled out because of the amount of fires. So having to deal with that, having to do this work so that you can actually even sometimes get a more competitive rate on your business insurance, right? So that you can make sure to say, yes, we have looked at our climate risks. We have looked at the financial implications of this. We have a mitigation strategy. We have additional policies and backstops, and this is how we're going to be resilient in this space.
Yeah, and we'll cover the different requirements for the IFRS and what's needed. Just before, we have a poll running during this webinar. We have actually 58% of the folks in this webinar that will be impacted by the Californian regulation. And what do you see this as a US phenomenon or part of a global convergence with CSRD, SECR? I think everybody's kind of merging towards the same goal here.
Yeah, I think with there's a strong harmonization between a lot of the different ESG frameworks. And I think that is due to, the IFRS realized that a lot of this work is going to be done in the accounting world. Right? It's non-financial data being paired with financial data. So that falls very squarely in the accounting world. And so, they said, okay, we need a standards body to come alongside us and to help us with the sustainability requirements. And so they developed the ISSB, the International Society of International Sustainable Standards Board. And it really started in November of 21. So that's how new a lot of this stuff is. But just from starting then and releasing, S1 and S2, it's already started kind of to stick a stake in the ground and saying, this is what we're going to measure. So we can start comparing really for the first time, apples to apples. And I think that's making investors very happy because they haven't been able to get that apples to apples comparison in terms of ESG and sustainability of companies.
Okay, great. Thank you. So first, on this first topic, maybe to wrap up, here's a thought for everyone watching. If climate disclosure became mandatory in your state or sector tomorrow, would your company be ready to report, or would it scramble to even find scope 1 and 2? That's really a food for thoughts. We'll move on to the second topic, which is what are the biggest roadblocks to climate action? Because even though it's the emergencies here, most of them are still trying to navigate the rising expectations. So Alexis and also Jennifer, you are supporting customers to overcome these roadblocks. What are they currently, and how do you think we can better overcome them?
I think one of the biggest challenges that I find with clients is helping them just find the data. And getting clean data or setting up their systems to track data, right? So a lot of companies, they can pull spend data for a lot of this stuff. We know that activity data, actual mileage in some cases, is a much better way, a much more accurate way to measure. And so setting up systems to be able to calculate the mileage of your business travel versus having to use spend data. Right. So just accessing the data is sometimes can be challenging.
And they're underestimating maybe this complexity.
Yeah. So, I mean, even before that, so once you get started with a particular framework, carbon accounting or a framework that's slightly larger than carbon accounting, but encompasses carbon accounting, so like IFRS or CSRD, that's going to be the challenge. But I think even if we take a step back before that, there's a bit of a challenge of figuring out which framework will apply to you, especially if you're in that $1 billion company range. You are most likely subject to regulations in the EU. You might be subject to regulations in Japan. there's the Californian regulation, and then there's New York coming up with something similar, and so on and so forth. So and you're probably reporting some of that stuff to a stock exchange or to an asset manager or to a customer. So you're a bit overwhelmed with perhaps standards, and there's a risk of duplicating stuff. So I think part of the challenge is also figuring out what the common trunk of all these things are. And I mean, of course, I'm preaching from my own parish here, but it's also making sure you answer the stuff once, and then you can slice and dice this information into whatever standard is required from you. So carbon accounting, if we just take that one, there's a format to report that on in the UK, SECR. There's going to be a format to report that on in California, SP253. There's going to be a format. I mean, they're not all that different, but every regulator has his own idea of which orders to bring things on. And so you can do all that manually, or perhaps you can let a computer, ease the path for you. So that's one thing. And then to your point, Jennifer, the biggest pain point for companies is twofold. It's to then collect the data, and then once you have the data, convert it into the metric, the format that's expected. So if I take carbon accounting is something that you can do very well or very poorly, right? Depending on how much detail you expect. So it also depends on which state of the climate journey you are on. If you're only getting started, you're probably going to want to track your scope 1 and 2, so your electricity or fuel consumption data pretty well. And then scope 3, get a high-level overview with what you were saying, a spend-based approach. But then if you're a little further along your journey, you're going to want to have a clearer view of your scope 3, with basically replacing spend analysis, how much steel have I bought, to what we call activity analysis, how many tons of steel have I bought, where have I bought them from, which steel is of a better kind from an impact perspective, and so on and so forth. And so that journey of understanding how granular your data needs to be is also a little unsettling if you're getting started. And so you need prioritization rules. So you need help. It can come from advice by experts like Jennifer, but you can also get help with automation from platforms around how do I capture the data more easily. So integrations, there's Gen AI now. Some of that stuff can be automatically put into a template that fits what a software can easily crunch. And then once you have the data, you need conversion metrics into, say, carbon, and that's also where you need automation. And then you need to actually produce the reporting. So you also need this automation flow. So all of that stuff, you can essentially decide to hire 10 people, or maybe spend a little bit less time on it, especially if it's new, especially if you only have 1 or 2 people, etc., etc. So I could go on with this for a while, but maybe I'll give you the floor back, Jennifer.
Well, it's still such a new thing, for a lot of us to even look at this data. Here in the US, it's still, it's still new. And for a lot of B Corps, I think in the last question we had asked why the B Corp should pay attention to this. So 60% of B Corps do not measure and do not report. While the new standards that just got released April 8th, you're going to have to even be able to maintain your B Corp certification for many companies to do just a baseline assessment. So I think having folks that have never had to do this before, is and having a large number of folks that are going to have to start doing this, it's better to get ahead of it, because there's limited number of folks that know how to do this, and software's out there. And so to get ahead of it so that you can get in queue to get this done, before it's too late, before you end up having to report or start getting asked to report and start to lose those vendor relationships because you just don't have your numbers. But understanding complexity, setting up your systems so that you can mature in the ways that Alexis just described is the best way to roll. And you don't have to be absolutely 100% perfect on all your numbers the very first year you report. You can start with scopes 1 and 2. Yeah.
And we've discussed the challenges of basically reducing the pain and the associated cost of collecting data, producing reports, and so on. But I think on the carbon accounting, we are in a place where if you're new to the topic, it might look super complex, but it's actually a very standardized thing. So it's a very streamlined journey. I mean, we've done it for thousands of companies, so we know how to tailor the experience to the maturity level, essentially, of the company. But there is with this SP 253 regulation something that's a little newer to many people. It's this notion of risk, and scenarios. Because everybody's good at taking a snapshot of where you are today. But I think the sector as a whole still needs to learn how to assess risks, and so risks, maybe we have a slide for it, but risks are twofold, right? They are what we call physical risks. So is my building going to get flooded? Is my field, going to dry out for my cows to eat the grass on? That's a physical risk. I'm not going to get as much milk as I had before. My yield on corn is not going to be as good. But then there's a transition risk. I'm in the gas pump business, and now every car is going electric. So, do I still have a job in 15 years? So this kind of stuff is also being standardized. It can also be automated. You can map out all your buildings. You can map out all the buildings of your supply chain. And then there are databases with climate risk. So you can automate this, but it is even more so a newer field. And then you have to model the impact on your turnover. So there's more complexity there. I think in these regulations, first and foremost, you want the snapshot. But as the sector matures, so will the tools and so will the expertise within the companies and with the experts such as Jennifer. That will also mature to how to best model your climate risk. So I think that's something else to think about. The work is not done just reporting. You also have to think about the future and how to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, you're very right to mention that. And I think the Greenlease platform aligns with TCFD, IFRS, and CSRD, but it was a perfect segue for me to really jump on this quick fire training on SB 253, 261, and TCFD. Jennifer, maybe could you clarify exactly what do they require in practice, and could you, so that everybody here can at least take this home and understand very much what they need to do now and in the future.
Right. And so we talked a little bit about 253. So you're going to be, measuring your scopes 1 and 2 and 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 is going to be due, starting to report in 2026 on 2025 data. And you're actually going to have a requirement of limited assurance over that data. So you're going to need to not only measure, but you're going to need to have somebody review that data and provide some limited assurance over it. Scope 3, you're going to need to start reporting in 2027. And they're going to give you a couple of years to get that Scope 3 right before they ask for limited assurance over that. So limited assurance for that doesn't start until 2030. But then, beyond that, it's every year you're going to need to report Scopes 1, 2, and 3. You're going to have limited assurance over the numbers, just to kind of hold you accountable that you're actually measuring things correctly and accurately and talking about it accurately. 261, that is the climate-related financial risks, and as Alexis was talking about, the climate scenario piece and the transition piece, and I will say, the oversight body for this CARB, California Air Resource Board, is actually still putting together implementation guidelines for this. So we still don't know what the scope and boundary is that they want for the climate scenario analysis, right? So there's still some unknowns that we're waiting to hear back from. We were supposed to get some hardcore this is how we're going to implement this coming in July. However, they recently came out with a webinar last week talking about how far they've gotten so far in figuring out how to implement this. They still had some questions that they're posing out to the public saying, hey, here's some things that we're still working through. What recommendations do you have? Where should we look for some of this stuff? Because there's a lot of stuff already done in the accounting world that they can literally just pull from to be able to implement, the reporting for this. And so they've actually said that they're going to push, and they may not have all the answers until the end of the year, but they're still going to hold that reporting starting in 2026 date. So I highly recommend getting as much done for these 2 reports as possible until you get to those points of like, well, we need more guidance on the climate scenario analysis, right? Like maybe we hold off on that until the end of the year.
And so what we're seeing here is with assurance as well is the assurance timeline is how fast are companies expected to go from voluntary to auditable reporting, really have a third party auditing the reporting. So it's 2026 for scope 1 and 2, 2030 for scope 3. And by the way, here you have a question on scope 3 from Nadim. He wants to discuss the scope 3, more particularly downstream vendor GHG emissions, because it's not required to disclose in the US, but it is in Europe. So maybe if you guys have a take on this.
I mean, the way to think about scope 3, right? So Jennifer said there are 15 categories, but the way it's typically trickles down is you say, look, you can report the whole thing, but there are some areas that are more or less where the accuracy requirements are more or less stringent. So I'll give you in the GHG protocol. So it's standardized the way what you need to report. What you generally need to report on is what we call scope 3.1, which is as a rule, before I go into the details, what you generally need to report on is what is material, right? What would affect your emissions in general. So it's the big buckets where you have the most emissions. And what you tend to see is the biggest bucket for most companies, right, is their purchase of goods and services, otherwise known as scope 3.1. And here the structure of that is very different from one company to another. So if you're a car manufacturer, you buy a lot of steel, a lot of spare parts from a lot of people, right? So that's a big bucket. But then you also have the big bucket of use of goods sold. So if you sell cars, people drive them and they put fuel in them, and that's actually half your emissions, right? So it's not you per se emitting, but it is your car, and you wouldn't be in business if people couldn't put oil in it, right? So now if you're selling refrigerators, same thing, right? Most of the emissions is in people plugging them at home, and you can't run a refrigerator if it doesn't run, basically. Or so these tends to be the big buckets. But and I won't do like all 15 categories, but just to give you a glimpse, if you're not already aware, if you're a financial institution, the biggest bucket tends to be your scope 3.15, which is basically the emissions of your investment. So if I am BlackRock, right, and I own 10% of every company, I have 10% of all their emissions to be accounted for. So now with this, that's I don't want. No one should be like afraid of the extent of data that you need to report, because there are ways to get an immediate estimation on all of those things, which are quick. So from a reporting perspective, I think people overestimate the difficulty of reporting scope 3, because you can get a very good snapshot view by looking at your spend. So if I'm spending $1 billion with suppliers, I can look at all these expenses and then basically quickly estimate, based on who I'm buying from, what the emissions are. Now, the problem with this, the good thing with this approach is you immediately comply. The problem with this approach is that it's not very accurate, because if I do this, well, how do I actually reduce my scope 3? I mean, if the only option would be to spend less, which could be like unrealistic from a business perspective. So you need to switch, and you alluded to that, Jennifer, from that spend-based to that activity-based approach on those categories that are material, that are significant to you. And that is where you start to require physical data, activity data. So if I take the car industry, buying steel, everybody speaks about steel these days. Well, who do I buy steel from? Well, I have to know who it is. I have to know how many tons of steel I'm buying. I have to know what's the average ton of CO2 for a ton of steel. And I can work with an industry average, and that's pretty good. But then I can go down and then work with a supplier average. So it's this journey of ever increasing accuracy that is the work that companies need to mature on. And maybe when I'm describing it like this, it looks kind of complex, but you actually have tools that can guide you, prioritize, help you reach out to your scope 3, and so on and so forth. So let's not over-exaggerate the difficulty, but let's think of it as a multi-year journey to more accuracy and more impact.
Yeah. So what you understand, Nadim, is that Alex is passionate about scope 3, and so we'll be very happy to discuss that. But we really need to move forward with
the one point I did want to make, because in the US you will have to report all of what is material in your scope 3. So that those California regulations are for public and private companies. So non-public entities that are $1 billion or more are going to have to report. So, and you're going to have to know what is material of scope 3 to report. And if that is your downstream, then you need to be reporting that.
On the Californian Senate bills, it's also linked to an international standards that's looking at some harmonization. So would you be able to kind of clarify what's the role of ISSB in all of this? And then we'll quickly jump into the IFRS S1 and S2.
Awesome. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, the ISSB, they came around in November of 21. So they were new kids on the block in the accounting world. But they very quickly started harmonizing a lot of the frameworks and pulling them together. So SASB, TCFD, CDP, all of the acronyms that we have in the sustainability world. And they pulled them together, really pull in starting with 2 standards, S1 and S2. S1 deals with, the sustainability related financial disclosures, and then S2, climate related financial disclosures. So you can think of S2 as, TCFD and, California 261. They all kind of harmonize together. They have different nuance, a little bit different nuances in each, but they do harmonize together. And like I said, this is really fantastic because it's been a little wild west in the framework world, and everybody was asking for very drastically different things and measuring things in very drastically different ways. So that we have these standards now, and all the frameworks are starting to run updates and harmonize together, so that folks aren't having to basically reinvent the wheel for every report, so that you can, as Alexis put it, do all your measurement in one system and then just slice and dice the reports for which way you want, because you have that information and data. So this really has been fantastic to harmonize everything and get everyone on the same page. And investors were screaming for this for the last 10 years because it was just crazy making for them to try to figure out who is a better investment, right?
And speaking of other frameworks ramping up and putting themselves on the same page, we have B Corp, and you have a special relationship with B Corps. They have been doing a strong evolution and update on the standard. So how is it now more closer to the others? Because sometimes we tend to think about B Corps are small, but Green is also a certified B Corp. So how is that really raising the bar?
Yeah. B Corp, Sensiba is a B Corp. I'm the head beekeeper here. I help companies do B Corp certification. I'm the governance chair for B Local Bay Area. So yes, I have a very intimate view of the B Corp world. And so yes, April 8th, new standards got dropped, and they have a new section called climate action. And the standards have shifted from the point system that they had before. So in the previous version 6, there were 5 different areas, and you needed to score a minimum of 80 points across all areas. You could lean into one area versus another, right? And to be able to get through certification. Well, now the new standards, there are basically 7 different topic theme areas, and you've got what I call the 8th topic area, the foundational requirements. But you've got 8 different areas, and you're going to have to meet that bar in all of those areas, and the things that you need to have done and requirements to be able to meet in all those areas, instead of being able to just pick up points from one area to the other. Point system is gone. You have to meet. And so the climate action area is going to have companies, disclosing their climate action plans, putting together emissions data and reporting on your emissions data. Some level size companies, because they do scale it on size, to be representative of what a company should be doing at any given size. Some companies will need to do SBTI filings. Some companies will need to have assurance over their numbers. So this is very different, considering that 60% of B Corps have not done this work in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be a huge uplift for B Corps.
And I would say, we throw a lot of acronym out there, SP 253, IFRS, TCFD. So I think for the layman, so to speak, it's a little hard to get excited to, that maybe this company is compliant with IFRS S1 or S2. So these communication type certification are important, because while you don't know all the details that go into B Corp, as a marketing asset, and I don't want to demean the fact that it's just that, it's a real effort, but if you've got to send a signal out into the world that you've been doing real work, making your company impactful, people, planet, profit, without talking to experts, the B Corp stamp really helps businesses, basically showcasing their efforts without having to explain all the complexity. And now, and I think that's a big benefit of it. And now that basically B Corp is getting really serious about climate, it's essentially a very useful tool to help climate get a boost from their climate action. And I don't want this to sound like greenwashing or superficial, because our experience working with ESG managers is they need to defend their budget. All CEOs are not absolutely convinced of the ROI of this. And so, but they do understand the ROI of branding. They do understand the ROI of boosting employee engagement and all those things. So it shouldn't be just that, but having that booster is really helpful for people who are leading these topics within their organizations.
Right. And over the, with this new standard that dropped, it aligns and harmonizes very much with GRI, Global Reporting Initiative. And in the actual standard, if you open up the standard documents, every single question B Lab has done a beautiful job of really coordinating, correlating how it is interoperable with some of the other standards, and saying this question actually adheres to this, this, and this, and it will point out the exact standard within the own B Corp standard document. So they've done a really beautiful job of documenting that, so that folks can understand, well, answering this question, it's not just a B Corp question. Oh, wait, no, this applies to SASB, GRI, S1, all the other standards.
Yeah. So maybe before, what do you say, Alexis? Maybe they were just louder about purpose, but they will be now actually further ahead than their peers. That's what we need to do. So, and how do we really shift from ESG as communication to ESG as capital risk? I think it's the last topic we want to cover today. And Alexis has, I'm sure, a lot of great case studies from how to turn your compliance into strategy and build a real use case for that. So I'll let you start the discussion here.
Yeah, so I think a lot of companies certainly start with compliance because there's little debate on why it needs to be done, right? But this market has existed before compliance because some companies derive a lot of value from it, and sometimes they do it before there's a compliance obligation. So B Corp is a perfect example, and we all have in mind the Patagonia example or these types of companies. But now let's say you weren't doing it before, and now there's compliance. So where do you derive the value? I think as more companies need to comply, they essentially need to figure out their scope 3. So they need to figure out which ones of their suppliers can help them hit their targets. And so it becomes a business requirement, not a legal obligation for a lot of their suppliers to start disclosing emissions. So again, a lot of our customers, they are exposed at 50-70% of their customer base with customers who ask climate disclosure. So basically, they risk losing RFPs if they're like the only guys not reporting. So, that's pure ROI. And of course, an RFP is often decided on the quality of your products, but when everything else is equal, it could very well be the climate part that makes the difference. So this is every day something we see. Of course, even better if you're not just disclosing, but your product is actually a way for your customer to improve his impact, because you're selling, low carbon steel, low carbon plastic, low carbon, you name it. So that's one. Now, a lot of companies so that's that's on the customer side. We talked on the supply chain side, understanding where you are at risk of not being able to source the key stuff that you need to be in business. So in the agricultural space, that's very obvious that climate is impacting the provision of natural resources because of simply things growing not as well or differently or in different places. When you're in the food business, but that is true of many businesses. So in the insurance business, right, you might be at risk because some of your customers might have much higher expenses due to climate change. And so if you're not able to map this, right, if you're in the banking business, you're lending money to people, their ability to reimburse might be affected if they have themselves not anticipated their climate risk. So, this is not a theory. This is something that will affect GDP worldwide. So this is it. And then that's just, on the pure business side of things. Now, let's say you are doing it. Now, that's a different story. Once you start doing it, does this have to be a human labor intensive activity where you have to recruit a ton of people to get it done? Or can you maybe go from a team of 10 to a team of 2 or a team of 1 to get the same job done because you have accelerated all those frictions, right? Which is collecting data, which is analyzing it, which is crunching reports. So that is, of course, where, again, preaching from my own parish here, a software can automate a lot of that friction. And so this is also a cost thing that you drive down, basically, because compliance shouldn't be a cost. Yeah, it should be something that you can leverage for your business.
And so you were speaking about the tool, and really this tool integrates financial planning, GHG reporting, and scenario modeling. Would you have a practical example, like a company, to illustrate how they've been using this to drive value creation?
I mean, a lot of companies are in this space, but there are a lot of obvious examples of company tracking their emissions, but even more so tracking their avoided emissions against a reference scenario. So basically, really showcasing how their product is an improvement for the same thing. I mean, just off the top of my mind, we have a customer called EODev, which makes hydrogen electricity generators. When the grid, when your site goes offline, and you need your factory to keep running, or your data center to keep running, and then suddenly there's a massive electricity outing, which happens a lot in the US. These companies have to invest in electricity generators. And most often they do it on diesel electricity generators because stuff needs to keep running. Well, okay, that's great, but we all know the carbon footprint of data centers, of AI is massively increasing, and that's a problem too. Well, here's a company that essentially is tracking the footprint of its hydrogen generators, and it's also tracking the footprint of its product, and it's showing that its product is basically 10 times better in terms of carbon footprinting, and the cost is actually not that different from a diesel generator. So then suddenly it becomes a real selling point. Basically, I mean, we have 50 examples like this. I'll give you just one other one. We work with a bike manufacturer, a private equity-owned bike manufacturer, which is basically a consolidation of a lot of bike manufacturers to create, a single big group. And so these guys, their biggest footprint is buying aluminium, because that's what you need to do the frame of a bike, right? And so if you can buy low carbon aluminium, you've got a better bike. Okay, great. Bike is also better than a car, but the subtlety is not there. Because it's private equity owned, they draw a lot of debt. So they borrow a lot of money to keep buying new, facilities and consolidate and become a bigger group. And so what their CFO cares a lot about is the interest rate of the money that it borrows. And we saw that helping these guys out, at one point they were at risk of slightly increasing their emissions, and they totally freaked out. And we were kind of surprised because usually people are not all that stressed about the thing, but in the covenants of their borrowing contracts, it was written that if they were lowering their carbon footprint, their interest rates would lower. And so as they were improving their emissions, they were decreasing the cost of capital. And so because they were basically owned by or they had borrowed a lot of money from a net zero fund of a private equity fund, which had this as a principle. And this is just an example, but where I'm getting at is increasingly you see the interest rates of going down based on decarbonization trajectories. And it kind of makes sense from an economic point of view, because basically a company that is better fit for a net zero world is in fact a lower risk. So I would like to say this is generalized. It is not the case, but I do see a world where this scales.
Yeah. And I know, Jennifer, you have a nice opportunity story to share with us.
So we worked with a wine company on doing their carbon footprint. And after doing gathering all the data and evaluating, we really recognized where exactly their biggest kind of offender was, which was their shipping, right? Heavy wine cases. That was one of their main offenders. And so we one of our recommendations to them was kind of scandalous, which was to lightweight the bottles. There's this myth in the wine industry that the heavier the bottle, the better the wine. And I don't know about you, but I've had some really bad wine in heavy bottles and some really great wine in really light bottles. So kind of a myth. And so, we recommended, hey, lightweight the glass on your bottle by 5%. That'll make the cases lighter. It will lower your footprint in actually producing the glass for your bottles, because you're going to need to heat less glass to make more, make your bottles. And they were scandalized by the statement and said, well, we'll try it with 2 brands, but we don't want to tell anybody about it. Like, okay, because they thought wholeheartedly that their customers were going to notice. And so they went ahead and did 2 brands, and they lightweighted the bottles. We pulled 5% of the glass off the bottle, mainly from the bottom of the bottle. They saved $1 million their first year. And just from shipping costs, from bottle production. And then what we didn't really foresee was they had wonderful top line growth, because the cases weigh less. So the folks in the stores that were building those beautiful big displays in the front of the stores knew which cases weighed less. And so they were taking those cases and those bottles of wine to build those displays, which gave them much more prominent placement in the store, and they sold more. So they actually had a really huge bump to their top line growth by surprise. And they now have lightweighted their entire line. They saw how much the information they got from doing the carbon footprinting, and they started doing water analysis. And they've, since 2015, invested about 19 million into their sustainability initiatives. And since then, they've resulted in $26 million in savings to their bottom line, just from doing the carbon emissions, the energy efficiency, the glass lightweighting, the water reuse and conservation, all this stuff, from all of the data and metrics that they've gathered. They made real tangible improvements that really did bolster the bottom line and gave them some really great top line growth.
Those are 2 really great examples to illustrate the move from compliance burden to strategy enabler.
Exactly, and sometimes we forget the most obvious examples, right?
Yeah.
But for scope 1 and 2, when you basically improve the energy efficiency of your buildings, could require a small investment to better isolate, change, what type of heating system you have, or AC or whatever. But in fact, the ROI is usually super quick. So you reduce your bill. So there are some areas where, like the wine bottle example, but just your building, where it's very, very obvious that you can harmonize decarbonization, improving your impact with reducing your bill. So I always forget the most obvious example, but this comes up all the time.
Right. And so I know we are starting to get closer to the end of this webinar. So I just want to leave some time for the auditors. We just had a couple slides to finish, but just want to leave some time for the auditors to ask a question or several questions. There's no limits, but thank you so much for joining us. And Jennifer, Alexis, thank you for your awesome
I think we have a question.
Yes.
Maybe you can help out, Noemie.
So lightweighting is a practical and measurable step toward funding sustainability initiatives. By reducing material use and shipping weight, companies can lower costs while improving environmental performance.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
That's a very great summary. Thank you so much, Melinda.
Yeah.
That's a great summary. If anybody has a questions, obviously Alexis, Jennifer are also very happy to meet with all of you. Thank you for being here.
And we have a great partnership with Sensiba. So we bring obviously all the automation from our platform, but a lot of companies do appreciate the human support, the expertise that Sensiba brings. So we hope it's the best of both worlds, and you're more than welcome to reach out to us if you want to see what it actually looks like. So.
Yes. As of us, we wish you a very good day, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you.